Racist judge rejects black woman's case, then realizes she's the key witness that can end his career. Dark secrets can hide behind polished gavels and austere court benches, and nowhere is this truer than in Montgomery, Alabama, the cradle of the civil rights movement. Judge Marcus Winston, long lauded for his stern rulings, stands as a symbol of authority. Yet beneath that veneer lies an unsettling truth. A man whose deep-seated prejudice threatens to unhinge the very foundation of justice. When Celeste Davis, a determined black woman, appears before him, seeking redress, Winston dismisses her claim without a second thought. Little does he realize Celeste holds evidence capable of dismantling his entire career and exposing a network of corruption. Montgomery's sunlit streets hummed with a restless energy as Celeste Davis parked her aging sedan in front of the grand building that housed the Montgomery County Courthouse. The edifice stood just blocks away from the historic Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once preached. For Celeste, a proud daughter of the South, the city's past was not just words in a textbook. It was a living tapestry of struggle and triumph. Growing up, she'd listened raptly to her late father, James Davis, a former sanitation worker who'd marched with civil rights activists in the 1960s. He often told her, "The law can be a mighty weapon, baby girl, but only if wielded by the right hands." That memory propelled her through the courthouse doors. She was there to pursue justice for herself, for others who might find themselves in similar circumstances, and in some small way, for the generations that came before her. On the ride up in the elevator, Celeste felt the eyes of strangers flick over her. Some faces indifferent, others curious. She clutched a folder of documents close to her chest, containing the medical records and text messages that proved she'd been assaulted and harassed at her place of work. Those documents were her ammunition in a world where intangible things like racism and intimidation often slipped through the cracks of the law. Celeste had never imagined herself in a courtroom, at least not on this side of the bench. She grew up dreaming of becoming an elementary school teacher, but life took her on a different path, a job in insurance, stable, but not her passion. After the incident with her co-worker Kyle Frazier, she found herself dragged into the legal system she had once believed was built to protect people like her. Kyle had not only insulted her using racial slurs, but later assaulted her when she confronted him about his hateful language. The subsequent bruises on her side and arms proved his violence was not merely verbal. Initially, Celeste believed that if she gathered enough evidence and followed the rules, the court would vindicate her. Her father's faith in the legal system, despite its flaws, glowed in her memory like a beacon. But as Celeste exited the elevator and walked the corridor leading to courtroom 4B, a creeping dread took hold. She had heard the rumors Judge Marcus Winston, though rarely challenged, was known to have a certain leaning. Words like traditionalist and old school were often whispered. Sometimes people added other terms, biased, uncompromising, and even prejudiced. Still, Celeste held tight to her father's words. Justice, though slow, would eventually prevail. The hallway was lit by fluorescent lights that washed over the worn linoleum floors, creating a subdued institutional atmosphere. Celeste stopped briefly outside the courtroom door to catch her breath and gather her courage. Her lawyer, Anika Whitfield, a young and sharp attorney with an impressive track record, had already gone in to set up. When Celeste finally pushed the heavy door open, she saw Anika waving from a table at the front. The gallery was half filled with people waiting for their cases to be called, some lawyers, some plaintiffs, some defendants, and a scattering of curious onlookers. A hush seemed to dominate the space. Celeste slid into a chair beside Anika, scanning the front of the courtroom. Judge Winston was not yet on the bench, but a stern-faced clerk busied herself with files. On the opposing side sat Kyle Fraser, smirking confidently, his attorney whispering into his ear. "You ready?" Anika asked, leaning close. Her tone offered the sort of reassurance Celeste desperately needed. Celeste nodded, though her palms felt damp. "I am," she replied softly, wishing she sounded more certain than she felt. In that moment, Celeste thought she could almost see her father's weathered face, smiling at her from some cosmic vantage point, urging her on. The microphone at the front crackled to life. Soon the clerk announced the session's start. The door behind the bench opened, and Judge Marcus Winston emerged in a sweeping black robe. His features were chiseled, his eyes cold. Celeste braced herself, not realizing that the course of her life, and the judge's, was about to be irrevocably altered. Everyone in the courtroom rose when Winston took the bench. His presence was formidable. A hush settled, broken only by the shuffle of papers and the rustling of clothing as people sat back down. The clerk began reading out the day's docket, and Celeste's case landed second. She watched Winston's expression disinterested and distant. When Kyle's name was called alongside hers, Celeste saw Winston's brow furrow ever so slightly, as though inconvenienced. Anika introduced herself and Celeste, laying out a concise statement of the facts. Celeste had been racially harassed at work and eventually physically assaulted by Kyle Fraser. Hospital records documented bruised ribs and multiple contusions. Celeste had screenshots of text messages in which Kyle used vile racist language. Any unbiased observer, Celeste thought, would see it as a straightforward case, at least enough for a trial. Kyle's attorney countered with a casual air, implying Celeste was exaggerating injuries for financial gain. He painted Celeste as overly sensitive and looking for a quick payday. Celeste clenched her fists under the table. She reminded herself that the truth would surely prevail because that was what the courts were for, sorting fact from fiction. Then came the judge's turn to ask questions. Winston directed only a handful of perfunctory queries at Kyle's side. He spent more time grilling Celeste, scrutinizing the timeline of events, the authenticity of her text message screenshots, and why she hadn't reported the harassment sooner. Celeste tried to answer each question honestly and calmly, but Winston's tone felt razor-sharp. Every time Celeste looked at him, she saw disapproval etched into his stare. Finally, Winston leaned forward, tapping his pen on the desk. "I see no compelling evidence," he said, in a voice that resonated through the silent room. "Your text message screenshots are not verified by an independent third party, and the alleged injuries could have been sustained elsewhere. This court finds insufficient grounds to advance your claim of discrimination or assault to a full trial." He paused, then delivered a final blow. Case dismissed. Celeste felt the world tilt beneath her. A swirl of disbelief, anger, and helplessness overwhelmed her. Anika objected vehemently, citing the hospital records and the documented hateful messages. But Winston merely raised his hand, cutting her off. "You may refile if new compelling evidence emerges," he said dismissively, eyes flicking away to the next case. "For now, we're done." A smirk curved across Kyle's lips. Celeste wanted to scream, to argue, to do anything but remain silent. However, she could sense Winston's hostility, and she worried any protest might lead to a contempt charge. In that instant, Celeste understood the rumors that had circulated about Winston's prejudice were not just hearsay. She had seen it for herself, directed at her, in the cold mechanics of the legal system. Outside the courtroom, Celeste's composure cracked. She practically collapsed onto a wooden bench in the hallway, burying her face in her hands. Annika sat beside her, fuming. "I've never seen a case this clear-cut dismissed so quickly," Annika said, her voice trembling with outrage. "There's no legal justification for that. The judge didn't even allow a full evidentiary hearing." Celeste tried to steady her breath. "So that's it," she managed to say. "Kyle just walks away." "For now," Annika replied, placing a hand on Celeste's shoulder. "But we're not giving up. We can explore appeals or refile, just as Winston said, although he certainly didn't mean it kindly. We'll find a way." But Celeste couldn't shake the ominous feeling that she was up against more than a difficult judge. She was fighting a system ingrained with prejudice, and that system had teeth. The memory of Winston's cold eyes made her skin crawl. That evening, Celeste retreated to her modest one-bedroom apartment located in a quiet neighborhood near the Rosa Parks Museum. She had chosen the area because it reminded her of her father's unwavering pride in Montgomery's civil rights legacy. The warm orange glow of a sunset filtered through the blinds, but Celeste could find no comfort in the beauty outside. A storm of thoughts raged in her mind. She ignored the pile of mail on the kitchen counter and collapsed onto the couch. She played the day's events over and over, a tape she couldn't eject. How could Winston reject such obvious evidence Celeste's injuries were documented? She had direct messages of Kyle's hateful outbursts, yet Winston had waved it all aside. Her phone vibrated. She half expected it to be Annika, but the caller ID showed her mother's number. Celeste let the call go to voicemail. She wasn't ready to explain the humiliating defeat to her mother, who had been so certain that Celeste's father's dream of a just system would see her through. Exhausted yet restless, Celeste spent hours researching Judge Marcus Winston. His official biography was impressive, an alumnus of the University of Alabama School of Law, praised for his commitment to law and order, elected multiple times without serious opposition. She read about how Winston's strict interpretations often favored corporate defendants over individual plaintiffs. Nothing explicitly said he discriminated against black litigants, but Celeste found repeated stories online from local activists who accused Winston of racial bias. While scrolling, Celeste stumbled on an online discussion forum where anonymous posters talked about Winston's close ties to a corporation called Stanton Industrial. That name rang a bell. Stanton Industrial had faced multiple lawsuits alleging discriminatory hiring and promotion practices. Celeste recalled reading that Winston had presided over many of those cases, and the results usually went Stanton's way. She wondered if Winston's approach to law was less about justice and more about personal or political gain. Her phone buzzed again, a text message this time from a number she didn't recognize. "Don't lose hope. This judge has done worse. Keep fighting." Celeste's heart pounded. Who had sent it? She typed a reply. "Who is this?" No answer. She stared at the cryptic text, mind swirling with possibilities. Was it a whistleblower inside the courthouse? A previous victim of Winston's judgments? She couldn't know, but it fanned the tiny spark in her chest that refused to die out, a stubborn flame of resolve. Around midnight, Celeste called Annika. "I can't accept this," Celeste said, her voice echoing in the quiet. "If Winston's corrupt or biased, I need to prove it. Not just for me, but for everyone who's been shut out." "Are you with me?" Annika's voice on the line was weary, but determined. "I am. But we need more than accusations. We need a solid case evidence of wrongdoing, a documented pattern. Without that, No one will believe us. And Winston has allies, Celeste. This could get messy. Celeste exhaled softly. Let it, she answered. We can't let this stand. The next day, Celeste and Anika arrived at the courthouse again, not to file motions just yet, but to gather information. They headed to the clerk's office first, searching public records of Winston's most notable rulings. Scanning through hundreds of dockets, Celeste noted how quickly Winston had dismissed cases involving racial discrimination claims. The pattern seemed consistent. Winston favored large employers, real estate developers, and well-connected defendants. Amid the dusty volumes, Celeste felt a pang of sadness for how easily justice could be subverted. She recalled her father's battered copy of the Constitution, which he used to read to her at night, pointing to sections about equal protection under the law. That promise looked increasingly hollow in Winston's domain. When Celeste stepped out of the clerk's office to get some air, she noticed someone staring at her from the far side of the hallway. It was a woman in a courthouse uniform, perhaps a clerk or an administrative worker. She looked around nervously before approaching Celeste. "Excuse me," the woman said in a low voice. Up close, Celeste saw the small name tag pinned to the woman's shirt, R. Porter. "You're Celeste Davis, right? The lady who tried to sue Kyle Frazier." Celeste's shoulders tensed. She nodded cautiously. The woman glanced around. I was in the courtroom yesterday," she continued. "I handle some back-office filing. I'm sorry about what happened. I've seen Winston do that before. He shuts down cases that seem legitimate, especially when the plaintiff is—" The woman trailed off, pressing her lips together as though afraid to finish the sentence. Celeste's pulse quickened, especially when the plaintiff is Black R. Porter nodded reluctantly, leaning closer. "Look, I can't say too much. I need this job. But Winston's got connections. Been that way for years. A lot of folks suspect he gets favors and donations from big corporate interests around here. That's partly how he wins re-election so easily. People of color who step into his courtroom, they rarely stand a chance unless their lawyers have serious clout or the evidence is absolutely undeniable." Celeste swallowed. But my evidence was undeniable. Porter's expression wavered with sympathy. "I know. I'm sorry. This is how he operates. Some have tried to report him to the Alabama Judicial Inquiry Commission, but no one's produced proof strong enough to stick. If you have anything, you should talk to them. And be careful who you trust." Before Celeste could ask more, Porter clammed up and hurried away, shooting fearful glances over her shoulder. Celeste watched her vanish into a stairwell, a mix of gratitude and apprehension coiling in her chest. She had just received confirmation from an inside source, albeit a nervous one, that Winston's reputation for unfair rulings extended beyond rumor. The question now was how to uncover concrete proof. Anika found Celeste shortly after. "I've got copies of a few rulings that look fishy," she said, holding a stack of papers. "Let's see what we can piece together." Celeste nodded, still rattled by her brief conversation with Porter. "I just talked to someone who works here. She said Winston's definitely corrupt money, deals intimidation. But she didn't have any documents or anything that would hold up in an official probe." Anika sighed. "We'll keep digging. Maybe we can talk to the Judicial Inquiry Commission ourselves and see if they've heard other complaints." But Celeste couldn't shake a deeper feeling that a more personal vendetta lurked behind Winston's manner. It wasn't just about corporate favors. The hatred in his eyes when he'd summarily dismissed her case felt raw, visceral. She found herself remembering her father's stories of old guard racism officials who publicly claimed neutrality but worked behind the scenes to undermine civil rights advancements. Celeste wondered if Winston was just a more modern incarnation of that same hateful spirit. While Celeste pursued justice, life at her workplace became unbearable. She had taken medical leave after the assault, and upon returning, she discovered that the office atmosphere had grown frosty. The insurance company's management, mindful of legal liabilities, treated her with guarded politeness, but her co-workers seemed torn between sympathy and fear of associating too closely with her. Kyle Fraser was still employed, looming around the office corridors, brazenly smirking whenever he encountered Celeste. It felt surreal, an abuser validated by the system's failure, using the aftermath to gloat. Each day felt like navigating a minefield, her chest tightening whenever she sensed Kyle's presence. She confided in her direct supervisor, Patricia Shields, who admitted that corporate HR had made a decision. Celeste's complaint and lawsuit were disruptive, so they were transferring her to a different department. "We just want to minimize conflict," Patricia said, not meeting Celeste's eyes. Celeste could practically read the subtext. Instead of punishing Kyle, they were choosing to uproot her. The new department was smaller and offered fewer opportunities for advancement, meaning Celeste's professional future was effectively stunted. Although the move wasn't labeled a demotion, Celeste knew it was. Furious at the blatant injustice, she documented everything from the email HR sent to the quick shuffle to a less visible role. If Celeste ever managed to get her day in court again, she wanted this evidence of retaliation in her arsenal. One afternoon, as Celeste was clearing out her desk, Kyle sidled up. He pretended to browse the filing cabinets near her workstation, his gaze flicking over her with that all-too-familiar smirk. "Heard you're switching departments," he drawled. "Must be tough stirring up trouble and not getting anywhere. Maybe next time you'll think twice about messing with the big dogs." Celeste's hands tightened around a file folder. She fought back the urge to lash out. "You don't scare me," she said, in a voice that surprised even her with its calmness. He shrugged, feigning innocence. "Scare never. I'm just reminding you where things stand around here. Some of us have connections." With that, he walked away, leaving Celeste bristling. Alone, she stared at the empty space on her desk where family photos once sat. A picture of her father wearing his old Union jacket had always reminded her of resilience and perseverance. Packing it away felt symbolic, like she was retreating from the legacy he had fought so hard to establish. Yet Celeste also knew she was far from defeated. The relocation at work only fanned her determination to go after Kyle, and by extension, Winston. That evening, Celeste met Anika at a small cafe near the Southern Poverty Law Center's headquarters. The windows overlooked a street teeming with life students, local activists, families, strolling in the mild weather. The proximity to the SPLC felt both inspiring and daunting, reminding Celeste that countless civil rights battles had been waged on these streets. Anika had reached out to a private investigator named Georgia McLean, a former FBI agent who specialized in corruption cases. When Georgia arrived, Celeste immediately sensed her no-nonsense demeanor. She was tall with close-cropped hair that revealed a faint scar on her temple, and her gaze was direct, scrutinizing Celeste and Anika as though cataloging every detail. "You want me to dig into Winston, Georgia?" asked, setting down a black coffee. "I've tried before, you know. He's elusive, but people talk. So what exactly are you looking for?" Celeste inhaled, gathering her courage. "Any evidence of bribery, favoritism, intimidation, anything that would show that Winston has misused his power, especially in cases involving black plaintiffs or civil rights issues. My case got dismissed without any real justification, and we have reason to believe Winston did it deliberately." Georgia nodded, tapping her fingers on the table. "I've heard whispers, but Winston covers his tracks well. If he's taking money, it's probably through intermediaries. Still, he's not immune to making mistakes. I've got some old leads I can revisit." Annika leaned forward. "What do you think about his relationship with Stanton Industrial?" "We see repeated rulings in their favor." Georgia smirked. "Stanton Industrial, huh? They're a major force around here. Factories, real estate, political donations. If Winston's on their payroll, we might find a pattern in campaign contributions or connections to shell companies. But I warn you, this will take time, and it may be expensive." Celeste felt a flicker of hope. "If we can gather enough evidence, we can file a motion to reopen my case and force Winston's recusal. Maybe even get the Alabama Judicial Inquiry Commission to investigate. That's the idea," Georgia said. "But Winston's not likely to roll over. He'll fight back, and so will his benefactors. You ready for that?" Celeste looked between Georgia and Annika, then nodded. "Whatever it takes." Georgia laid out her plan. She would dig into Winston's financial records, campaign donations, property deeds, and known associates. She'd interview courthouse staff and lawyers who might have seen or heard something suspicious. Meanwhile, Celeste and Annika would continue scouring Winston's past rulings to establish a pattern of bias. They also agreed to speak with any plaintiffs who had come forward about Winston's questionable judgments. As Celeste left the cafe that night, she glanced at the gleaming facade of the Southern Poverty Law Center building, lit softly against the sky. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, as though channeling the spirit of civil rights activists who had once fought in these very streets. Winston might be powerful, but so were the legacies of those who had confronted injustice head-on. Over the next few weeks, Celeste juggled her reassigned position at work, now in a corner of the building far from the bustle she was used to, and her late-night crusade against Winston. Each evening, she met with Annika to sift through court files, building a spreadsheet of Winston's rulings. They highlighted every case involving allegations of racial discrimination, civil rights violations, or workplace harassment. A troubling trend emerged. Winston repeatedly dismissed cases that had strong evidence. Annika reached out to some of the attorneys who had litigated those cases. Most were reluctant to speak ill of a sitting judge, but a few acknowledged off the record that Winston's methods were unusually dismissive. One lawyer who insisted on anonymity recounted a time Winston threatened to hold him in contempt if he kept pushing inflammatory allegations in a civil rights case. The allegations in question. The plaintiff had photographic proof of racial slurs graffitied on her property. It was mind-boggling that Winston had labeled the evidence inconsequential. Meanwhile, Georgia McLean proved her worth by unearthing campaign finance documents that revealed large sums of money pouring into Winston's re-election coffers from corporate PACs linked to Stanton Industrial. Although this didn't constitute outright bribery, it reinforced the impression that Winston was in bed with powerful interests. Georgia also found that Winston's wife, a socialite named Clarissa Winston, sat on the board of a philanthropic organization heavily funded by the same conglomerate that owned Stanton Industrial. While these links weren't illegal on their face, they suggested a labyrinth of conflicts of interest. Celeste's insomnia returned with a vengeance. Every night she pored over the new scraps of evidence, trying to stitch them together into a coherent narrative strong enough to present to a judicial commission. She also worried about her safety. She noticed unfamiliar cars parked outside her apartment late at night. On one occasion, a black SUV tailed her for several blocks. When she tried to snap a photo, the SUV sped off. She confided in Annika, who told her to be cautious. Winston's allies might have money to hire private investigators or intimidation squads, she said grimly. Despite the nerves and constant anxiety, Celeste pressed on, driven by the knowledge that if Winston could crush her case so easily, he could do the same or worse to countless others. In the midst of their research, Celeste stumbled on a sealed case from Winston's early career, back when he had served as a district attorney. The notation read, 2002. Corruption Inquiry. Winston M. closed, Mash sealed. Celeste nearly dismissed it as unrelated, but she recalled hearing a vague rumor about Winston possibly burying evidence in a public corruption investigation. The specifics were murky, but if Winston had engaged in unethical conduct before it might form part of the pattern they needed. She mentioned this to Georgia, who nodded thoughtfully. Sealed cases can sometimes be unsealed if there's a compelling public interest, but it's not easy, the investigator warned. I might have some contacts who can tell me more. A week later, Georgia called Celeste, her tone urgent. I've found someone who claims to know about that 2002 corruption case. The name's Angela Miller. She was a junior clerk for the DA's office back then, and she disappeared after the investigation concluded. I managed to track her down in Birmingham. She's agreed to speak with us, but only off the record. Annika and Celeste took a day off work to travel to Birmingham. They met Angela Miller in a quiet cafe near the University of Alabama at Birmingham campus. Angela, a petite woman in her early 40s, looked visibly nervous, checking the windows repeatedly as though expecting someone to burst in. I was just 20 when I worked at the DA's office, Angela began after Celeste and Annika introduced themselves. I was naive, thinking I could make a difference. Then I found out that Winston, who was a rising star in the office, was suppressing evidence in a case involving county officials skimming public funds. We had documents that showed direct involvement by local bigwigs, and Winston was supposed to prosecute them. She exhaled, stirring her coffee with shaking hands. Celeste leaned in, heart-hammering. What happened? Angela pressed her lips into a thin line. It was like the documents vanished. Winston told me I must have been mistaken that the files didn't say what I thought they did. But I'd seen them. He threatened me, said I could lose my job, face perjury charges if I spoke out. Eventually, I realized Winston was in bed with the officials he was supposedly prosecuting. The case collapsed officially due to a lack of evidence. I left town after that. A heavy silence settled over the table. Annika broke it gently. Can you prove any of this? Do you have copies, or can you testify? Angela shook her head. The files were destroyed or locked away somewhere. And if Winston's people learn I'm talking about this, I could lose everything again. I finally rebuilt a life after leaving Montgomery. Celeste's chest tightened. Another victim intimidated by Winston. Another potential key witness. We're trying to bring him down, or at least expose his corruption, Celeste said carefully. Your testimony could be crucial. Angela glanced at the window once more. I'll think about it, she whispered. But I can't promise anything. I'm not young and fearless anymore. I have a family to protect. Despite the disappointment, Celeste felt a flicker of hope. Angela's story added another piece to the puzzle. Winston's corruption stretched back years, involving intimidation and possible evidence tampering. As Celeste's investigation deepened, she continued receiving mysterious text messages from the same unknown number. Each one offered cryptic hints or suggestions for where to look next. Check Winston's property records in Prattville. Follow the money from Stanton Industrial to Wincorp Foundation. Ask the Judicial Inquiry Commission about the 2002 closed-door hearing. Though Celeste repeatedly asked who was sending these messages, she never received an answer. She could only guess it was someone in Winston's circle who had grown disillusioned, or perhaps a courthouse insider like R. Porter. Following these leads proved fruitful. Anika unearthed property records showing Winston owned a luxurious lakefront house in Prattville, financed partially through a private lender connected to Stanton Industrial. The Wincorp Foundation turned out to be the philanthropic board that Winston's wife chaired, receiving large donations from Stanton's charitable arm. The 2002 closed-door hearing, indeed, was part of a hush-hush inquiry into prosecutorial misconduct, but the final report had been sealed. Armed with this trove of revelations, Celeste and Anika consulted an attorney who specialized in ethics complaints. They prepared a comprehensive file for the Alabama Judicial Inquiry Commission, detailing Winston's questionable rulings, suspicious campaign donations, probable conflicts of interest, and accounts from victims like Celeste and Angela Miller. Filing a formal complaint was like tossing a lit match into a powder keg. The reaction was swift. Within days, Celeste noticed she was being watched more openly. A black sedan sat parked across from her apartment for hours at a time. At work, her computer mysteriously lost files she had saved, presumably related to her case. The IT department claimed it was a glitch, but Celeste suspected sabotage. One evening, as Celeste returned from a grocery run, two men in suits confronted her at her apartment entrance. "We need to talk," one said, blocking her path. Celeste's heart pounded. She glanced around the parking lot, which was eerily empty. "We hear you're making trouble for Judge Winston," the second man said. "It's in your best interest to let sleeping dogs lie. We wouldn't want your activities to cause problems for you or your family." Fear rippled through Celeste, but a streak of defiance flared. "You think threatening me will make me back off?" she challenged, voice shaking slightly. "Go ahead. Do your worst. I'm not stopping." One man took a step closer, his breath hot against her cheek. "You're playing a dangerous game. Stop digging or you'll regret it." When they left, Celeste rushed inside and locked the door. She sank against the wall, feeling as though her legs might give out. The intimidation was now overt. She dialed Anika, voice trembling, recounting what had happened. Anika urged her to call the police, but Celeste hesitated. She had no proof of who those men were or how they might be tied to Winston, and she had little faith that Winston's influence didn't extend to local law enforcement. The next morning, Celeste woke up with red-rimmed eyes, exhausted yet resolute. If Winston was stooping to outright threats, it meant she and Anika were onto something big. Winston was afraid, which meant Celeste couldn't let fear paralyze her now. She quietly reached out to a local group known for protecting activists and whistleblowers. They set her up with a small security detail, 2 off-duty police officers who were recommended by a friend at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Celeste felt a little safer, though the pressure weighed heavily. Things took another sharp turn at Celeste's job. HR called her in for a meeting delivering shocking news. She was being let go due to budget constraints and downsizing. Celeste stared at the HR manager's stoic face, incredulous. She had been with the company for 4 years, consistently receiving positive evaluations. Downsizing was a flimsy excuse. When Celeste asked whether Kyle Frazier was also being laid off, the HR manager's eyes flicked away. "I can't disclose personnel details, Celeste, but I'm sorry. This decision is final." She knew it was retaliation. Kyle remained employed, and Celeste had become a liability. Though she felt panic at losing her livelihood, Celeste also recognized that being free of that toxic environment might ultimately be liberating, especially if she was about to wage a public battle against Winston. Still driving home with a box of her belongings felt like a defeat. In a single day, Celeste had lost not just her job, but also a piece of the stable life she'd worked hard to build. She had monthly bills, a car payment, and a small savings account that wouldn't stretch far. She steeled herself, telling herself that if she backed down now, Winston would win. And Celeste had no intention of letting a racist, corrupt judge dictate her future. As news of Celeste's firing spread among her friends and acquaintances, support began trickling in. A local non-profit that assisted victims of workplace discrimination offered her temporary contract work, helping them set up community events and manage administrative tasks. The pay was modest, but enough to keep her afloat. Meanwhile, Georgia McLean continued digging. She finally discovered an electronic trail suggesting Winston had received deposits into an offshore account shortly after dismissing multiple cases tied to Stanton Industrial. Although offshore accounts aren't inherently illegal, the timing and sums were highly suspicious, indicating potential quid pro quo arrangements. This was the breakthrough Celeste and Anika had been praying for. If they could link Winston directly to bribes or unreported financial gains, it would be a legal bombshell. Georgia, however, cautioned them to authenticate the evidence carefully. If this gets challenged in court or in a commission hearing, we need airtight verification, she said. For Celeste, the offshore account story was like an earthquake. She remembered how Winston had so casually dismissed her injuries, her text messages, and her entire plea for justice. Now she saw a reason that went beyond mere bigotry. Winston was financially incentivized to crush any claims that threatened his corporate backers. But Celeste also worried about Angela Miller, who might hold the key to exposing Winston's long-standing corruption. Angela's reticence was understandable. Without official protection, she risked retaliatory action. Celeste tried to convince Angela that now was the time to come forward. The swirling investigations, the multiple threads of evidence, and the support from Celeste's newly filed complaint gave Angela a crucial window. If she waited, Winston might slip away or bury the evidence deeper. Finally, after several pleading phone calls, Angela agreed to meet Celeste and Anika again, this time in Montgomery. Angela's voice trembled on the phone. I can't live in fear forever. If we're going to do this, let's do it, before I lose my nerve. One brisk morning, Celeste, Anika, Georgia and Angela convened in a secure meeting room at the offices of the non-profit Celeste now worked for. It was a small, windowless space with a single wooden table and 4 chairs. Angela looked as if she hadn't slept, her eyes ringed with dark circles. Anika began by outlining the progress made, the complaint filed with the Alabama Judicial Inquiry Commission, the offshore account trace, and the calls from multiple lawyers who'd had suspicious experiences in Winston's courtroom. If you corroborate your story about Winston's actions back in 2002, it would help substantiate a pattern of corruption going back decades, Anika said gently. Angela swallowed. Fine. I'm willing. But I want some assurances I don't have the funds for a legal battle if Winston countersues me for defamation. Anika nodded. We can request whistleblower protections. The Judicial Inquiry Commission might keep your identity confidential until they can secure your testimony in a formal proceeding. And we can assist you in finding pro bono legal support if Winston does something drastic. Angela closed her eyes, exhaling shakily. I kept an old file, she said softly. Back then I was so scared, but I made copies of what I found. It's on a USB drive, hidden. Winston never knew I managed to save anything. He assumed he destroyed every trace. She reached into her purse, extracting a small USB drive. The room fell silent. Angela placed it gently on the table. "I've never shown this to anyone. But if it helps bring him down, do what you need to do." Georgia took the drive carefully, slipping it into an envelope labeled "Privileged." "I'll have a trusted forensic specialist examine this. We won't let it out of our sight until we're sure it's secure." Celeste felt a surge of gratitude and relief. Angela was risking everything. Celeste felt deeply humbled by Angela's courage. Reaching out, she touched Angela's arm lightly. "Thank you," Celeste whispered. That same day, Celeste and Anika delivered an updated packet to the Judicial Inquiry Commission, now including Angela's sworn statement labeled Witness A to protect her identity and references to a sealed file that might contain incriminating documents. The Commission's office gave them a polite reception, though Celeste could sense the skepticism from staff members who had likely seen many claims of judicial misconduct fail to produce concrete evidence. Still, Celeste could see a flicker of genuine interest in one investigator's eyes, especially when they mentioned the possibility of financial records linking Winston to bribes. As summer rolled in with sweltering heat, Celeste received word that the Judicial Inquiry Commission planned to hold a preliminary hearing to determine whether they had enough to open a formal investigation into Winston. The hearing would be closed to the public in accordance with Commission rules, but Celeste, Anika, and Georgia were invited to present their evidence. Winston's legal team, an assembly of high-priced attorneys, fired back with motions to discredit Celeste's complaint as meritless and politically motivated. They claimed Celeste was a disgruntled former employee who invented accusations for personal gain. Their filings bristled with threats of countersuits. Anika was undeterred. She prepared Celeste and Angela Miller to testify at least in a preliminary capacity about their encounters with Winston's misconduct. Georgia compiled all the financial data cross-referenced with the property deeds and the offshore account evidence. Days before the hearing, Celeste found a note slipped under her apartment door. It read, "Drop the complaint or face consequences you can't imagine." There was no signature, no specific threat. But Celeste had no illusions about who might be behind it. She called Anika immediately. "I'm terrified," Celeste admitted. "What if these people come after me physically?" Anika's voice was somber. "I'll reach out to the ACLU and the SPLC. Maybe they can offer additional security measures. I know folks there who have dealt with intimidation before." "This is high stakes, Celeste. If Winston falls, he takes down a whole network of corrupt backers with him." Despite the fear, Celeste forged ahead. Part of her felt an unexpected clarity. She had started this journey seeking personal justice, but it had evolved into a broader mission. If she succeeded, she might free others from Winston's biased rulings. She might restore some faith in the idea that the law could be a champion for the downtrodden, not just a shield for the powerful. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived. Located in a modest building in downtown Montgomery, the Judicial Inquiry Commission's offices lacked the grandeur of a courtroom, no towering columns or ornate carvings. Instead, Celeste found a nondescript hallway lined with conference rooms and offices. Inside the hearing room, 6 commissioners sat behind a long table, judges, attorneys, and lay members appointed to oversee judicial conduct. They wore professional attire, their expressions neutral. On the opposite side sat Winston's defense team, sharply dressed in dark suits. Winston himself was conspicuously absent, but Celeste could sense his presence in the tension that filled the air. Anika opened with a statement summarizing the complaint against Winston. She introduced Celeste, who recounted her experience, her evidence-laden case dismissed without due process, the intimidation she faced afterward, and the financial connections to Stanton Industrial that correlated with Winston's rulings. Celeste's voice quavered at times, but she held herself steady, determined not to let fear overshadow her truth. Angela Miller. Her identity protected as witness. They provided a written statement detailing Winston's actions back in 2002. The commissioners read it silently, faces unreadable. Finally, Georgia McLean presented the financial records, including evidence of suspicious deposits into an offshore account and Winston's entangled relationship with Stanton Industrial. Murmurs rippled through the room. Winston's lead attorney rose next, launching into a blistering rebuttal. He insisted Celeste's claims were unsupported, that Angela Miller's statement was hearsay from a disgruntled ex-employee, and that the financial data was misinterpreted. Celeste watched the commissioners carefully, some scribbled notes. Others watched Winston's attorney with critical eyes. After hours of back and forth, the lead commissioner, an older gentleman with salt and pepper hair, cleared his throat. "We will deliberate on the evidence presented," he said in a measured tone. "If we find sufficient cause, we will initiate a formal inquiry into Judge Winston's conduct. You will receive our decision in writing." With that, the preliminary hearing concluded. Celeste stepped outside, exhaling as the heat enveloped her. She realized her hands were shaking. Anika and Georgia flanked her, both looking tired but resolute. "That went about as well as it could," Anika murmured. "Now we wait." 2 tense weeks crawled by. Celeste spent each day anxiously checking her phone and email for updates. Her security detail remained discreetly in place. An unmarked car often idled near her building, just in case. She tried to distract herself by volunteering at community events, but her thoughts circled back to Winston. Finally, an email arrived from the Judicial Inquiry Commission. Heart-pounding, Celeste called Anika and opened it together. The commission had decided there was sufficient cause to launch a formal investigation into Judge Marcus Winston. They stated that Celeste's evidence, Angela's testimony, and the financial records demanded further scrutiny. Winston would be summoned for questioning, and his caseload might be reassigned during the investigation. Celeste felt a surge of triumph. This was the first official step toward holding Winston accountable. However, the email also included a warning. Winston's legal team was fighting back aggressively, attempting to keep certain records sealed, and they would likely seek a court order to halt the commission's inquiry. Within days, local media caught wind of the story. The Montgomery Advertiser ran a piece headlined, "Judge Winston under investigation for possible corruption bias in civil rights cases." The article cited Celeste's complaint, referencing her claim of wrongful dismissal. Public opinion appeared split. Some folks believed Celeste was on a witch hunt. Others, especially those who had long suspected Winston, rallied behind her. Then one afternoon, Celeste's phone buzzed with a call from an unrecognized number. She answered, and a familiar voice spoke on the other end. "Ms. Davis, this is R. Porter from the courthouse." Celeste stiffened, stepping aside to a quiet corner. Porter sounded anxious, yet determined. "I have something you need to see," Porter said quickly. "Winston's people might suspect me, so this has to be discreet. Meet me at Oakwood Park near the pond at dusk." Though Celeste's heart hammered with caution, curiosity compelled her to agree. She alerted Anika and Georgia. They coordinated so a security detail would be nearby. That evening, Celeste arrived at Oakwood Park just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The pond glimmered orange and pink with reflected light. R. Porter emerged from behind a row of tall shrubs. She clutched a sealed manila envelope. "This is from Winston's private clerk files," she whispered, eyes darting nervously. "I found it by accident today, while reorganizing old records. They were supposed to be destroyed, but they weren't." Celeste took the envelope. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Copies of Winston's personal notes and correspondence with Stanton Industrial's legal team, discussing strategies for dismissing certain suits. There are references to your case, Celeste, specifically. He wrote about you by name, calling you a troublemaker. And there's also mention of Angela Miller's file from 2002. They wanted it buried." Celeste felt chills. This was possibly the smoking gun direct evidence that Winston conspired with corporate backers to sabotage justice. "Why are you giving this to me?" Celeste asked. Porter's lips trembled. "Because it's wrong," she said, "and people need to know. Take it and go. I can't be seen here." Before Celeste could thank her, Porter vanished into the shadows. Celeste, envelope in hand, walked quickly to where her security detail waited. She called Annika, voice trembling with excitement. "I think we have him," she said. The next morning, Celeste, Annika, and Georgia met in a secured office to examine the documents. The envelope contained multiple memos and letters, some on Winston's official judicial letterhead, others on Stanton Industrial stationery. Several memos were marked confidential, referencing preferred outcomes and mutual advantages. One document, dated just after Celeste's original hearing, explicitly mentioned Celeste Davis as a plaintiff who needed to be neutralized through prompt dismissal. The callous language made Celeste's blood boil. Georgia photographed and scanned each page for safekeeping, cross-referencing the contents with known case docket numbers. She let out a low whistle. "This is conclusive. If we present this to the commission, Winston's done. He might even face criminal charges." Annika's eyes flashed with triumph. "Yes, but we have to ensure it's admitted properly. Winston's lawyers will claim it was stolen or forged. We need a chain of custody and an expert to verify authenticity." Nonetheless, Celeste allowed herself a moment of relief. They finally possessed direct evidence linking Winston's bias and corruption. Angela's files, the offshore accounts, the intimidation, and now these explosive internal documents painted a damning picture. They promptly prepared an emergency filing to supplement their evidence before the commission. Hours later, the commission issued a notice that Winston had been formally suspended from presiding over any ongoing cases pending the outcome of the investigation. This was an unprecedented step. Rarely did a sitting judge lose his docket so abruptly. The local news ran the update in bold headlines: "Judge Winston suspended amid corruption inquiry." Winston himself remained out of sight. His legal team insisted he was on leave for personal matters and repeated their claims of Celeste's character assassination. Still, Celeste sensed the tide had turned. She had faced Winston's intimidation, risked her livelihood, and lost her job. Yet here she stood on the brink of toppling a corrupt pillar of the establishment. With Winston suspended, Celeste's lawsuit against Kyle Frazier was reassigned to a different judge, Gail Ramirez, known for her fairness and scrupulous attention to detail. Judge Ramirez reopened Celeste's complaint, allowing the case to proceed on its merits. Celeste felt a mix of déjà vu and cautious optimism as she returned to the same courthouse, albeit stepping into a different courtroom with a different judge. At trial, Celeste presented her medical records, text messages, and the testimony of 2 co-workers who confirmed Kyle's racist language and the day he assaulted Celeste. Kyle's attorney tried to question Celeste's motives, again suggesting she only wanted money or revenge for losing her job. But Celeste stayed composed, narrating the events, clearly letting the evidence speak for itself. Meanwhile, the public exposure of Winston's corruption meant Kyle could no longer rely on a friendly judge to save him. During cross-examination, Kyle stumbled over his own statements, contradicted earlier depositions, and even admitted to sending unpleasant texts to Celeste. The tension in the courtroom hung heavy, and Celeste was reminded of how differently her first hearing might have gone if Winston hadn't presided. After a week of testimony, Judge Ramirez delivered a decisive ruling Kyle was liable for assault battery and racial discrimination. She awarded Celeste significant damages to cover her medical expenses, lost wages, and the emotional trauma she had endured. The judge also ordered an injunction mandating Kyle to stay away from Celeste, effectively limiting his ability to harass her further. Tears blurred Celeste's vision when she heard the verdict. After so many months of feeling powerless, she finally experienced the sweet vindication of a just outcome. Annika squeezed her hand, beaming. Outside the courthouse, Celeste was greeted by supportive community members. Some carried signs that read, "Justice for Celeste," or "End corrupt judges." Now the local press jostled for interviews. She stood briefly on the steps, speaking into a barrage of microphones. "This victory isn't just for me," Celeste said, her voice shaky with emotion. "It's for anyone who has ever been silenced by a system meant to protect them. I'm grateful to have found a fair judge and to see that the truth can still prevail." Even as Celeste savored her legal victory against Kyle, the noose tightened around Winston. The Judicial Inquiry Commission's investigation moved swiftly now that they had R. Porter's documents. A formal hearing was scheduled, with the possibility of Winston facing criminal charges for bribery, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power. Stanton Industrial also became entangled in the scandal. Several of its top executives were subpoenaed for their role in funneling money to Winston's offshore accounts and philanthropic boards. The Montgomery Advertiser, in a series of front-page exposés, detailed how Winston had systematically dismantled discrimination cases, strong-armed witnesses, and received kickbacks. Angela Miller, once terrified, found the courage to speak openly with reporters, giving a face and a voice to the historical corruption Winston had carried out. Other victims came forward, describing Winston's intimidation tactics in open court, painting a picture of a deeply entrenched system that had for years favored the rich and powerful at the expense of justice. When Winston finally appeared in public, walking into the commission's hearing room, he looked haggard, no longer the confident, imposing figure who had sat so smugly on the bench. Cameras flashed as he entered, escorted by his attorneys. The hearing took place behind closed doors, but insiders reported that Winston's defense was in tatters, battered by the onslaught of documentary evidence and eyewitness accounts. Not even his political allies could save him from the depth of his misdeeds. Eventually, the commission issued its final ruling. Winston would be removed from his judgeship, disbarred, and referred to federal prosecutors for criminal investigation. Celeste watched the news coverage almost numb, with a mixture of relief and disbelief. It felt surreal to see the once feared judge toppled by his own corrupt dealings, with Winston ousted and Kyle held liable. Celeste began the delicate process of rebuilding her life. The damages awarded in her suit helped her regain financial stability, though she remained cautious about her safety. She used part of the funds to move into a better neighborhood, a place where she could feel at ease walking from her car to her front door at night. Her father's memory lingered in her thoughts. So often she wished he were alive to see how she had fought, how she refused to let injustice stand. One weekend, Celeste visited his grave, placing fresh flowers beside the worn headstone. She whispered, You were right, Dad. The law can be a weapon for good. We just have to be brave enough to wield it. Angela Miller, newly vindicated, also began a new chapter. With Celeste's help, Angela connected with non-profits that offered legal and emotional support for whistleblowers. She intended to move back to Montgomery, possibly to work in an administrative capacity at a law firm committed to civil rights. "I'm tired of running from my past," Angela told Celeste in one heartfelt conversation. Meanwhile, R. Porter quietly kept her job at the courthouse, though Celeste heard that new security measures were taken to ensure that staff who testified or assisted in the Winston case wouldn't face retaliation. Porter, who had risked her livelihood to hand over the crucial documents, remained humble, telling Celeste that seeing Winston fall was reward enough. Celeste, however, made sure Porter received recognition from the local activism community. Georgia McLean's reputation soared, leading to more cases investigating local corruption. She sometimes joked with Celeste that they had formed a dream team, but Celeste politely declined an invitation to join her investigative endeavors full-time. "I think I've had enough drama for a lifetime," Celeste would say. Yet she never forgot the lessons she learned about confronting powerful interests and the importance of shining a light into dark places. In a symbolic gesture, Celeste donated a portion of her legal settlement to fund a scholarship in her father's name at a local community college earmarked for Black students pursuing criminal justice or legal studies. She wanted to leave a legacy that would encourage future generations to stand firm against corruption and discrimination. She also spoke at community forums alongside Annika, recounting her journey from the humiliating dismissal of her case under Winston to the triumphant day in Judge Ramirez's courtroom, to her role in exposing Winston's corruption. Wherever she spoke, Celeste emphasized the power of persistence. "Don't ever let one unjust ruling make you believe justice is impossible," she would say to rapt audiences. "We have to keep pushing, keep digging, keep fighting, because sometimes that's the only way the truth ever sees the light of day." In time, Celeste found a new position at a small but respected law firm. Not as a lawyer, she wasn't trained for that, but as a legal researcher and case coordinator. She took pride in helping clients gather evidence, compile testimonies, and present their truths in court. Occasionally, she felt pangs of regret about not pursuing a law degree, but then she remembered how powerful she had been without formal credentials. One does not need a robe or a law license to demand what is right. Judge Winston, once the embodiment of unchecked power, became a cautionary tale. Law students at the University of Alabama sometimes studied his downfall in ethics classes, dissecting how prejudice and corruption can fester in the justice system if left unchecked. The greatest irony, Celeste mused, was that Winston's own hubris had handed his enemies the tools to dismantle him. For Celeste, life slowly returned to a new kind of normal one, in which she carried the scars of past battles, but also the wisdom of having seen a corrupt system undone from within. She still received the occasional silent phone call or suspicious tailing car reminders that Winston's network wasn't entirely dismantled. But Celeste stood unshaken. She had become, in her own quiet way, a symbol of resilience, proof that even the mightiest facade of injustice could be shattered. Corruption often hides behind the polished veneer of authority, and Judge Winston's disgrace laid bare just how deep those shadows can run. With her initial case dismissed and her reputation at stake, Celeste Davis refused to be silenced. She delved fearlessly into the labyrinth of secret deals and intimidation, uncovering a man whose prejudice and power were fueled by backroom alliances. Each new revelation emboldened her pursuit of justice, proving that truth can flourish even where hatred has festered for years. Celeste's victory is a reminder to stand unyielding, especially when the odds seem insurmountable. She stood up for herself, and in doing so shielded others who might have suffered the same fate. If you believe in the power of ordinary people to confront extraordinary injustice, make your voice heard. Like this video, share it far and wide, and subscribe for more stories where determination triumphs over adversity.